All right. Welcome to Tangentially Speaking, Brian. Good to have you.
Chris, pleasure, man. Nice to meet you.
You too. You too. So I was looking at your bio and your information online, which is all very impressive, and it reminds me of a conundrum that I face, and I wonder if we can start off talking about the conundrum. And
Let's get into the conundrum.
I mean, one theme that I see in your work is, it's probably the sort of most prominent theme, is human optimization, functioning at the highest level, doing physical things that are considered very difficult, like running marathons or Ironman competitions, or the various training that you subject yourself to and that you also lead others on. But then you also talk about stress reduction and dealing with stress. And I think in your email to me, you said, like, I'm mostly interested in stress, and that's kind of what I'm dealing with. And I look at these things and I think nothing would stress me out more than training to run a fucking marathon, dude.
Yeah.
Like, I get stressed, running to the mailbox and back. And I mean, I'm joking, but there is something about the human optimization movement that I feel like it generates a certain kind of stress, because it sets people up to feel like, I'm not functioning at my highest possible level. I'm not taking the right supplements. I don't have as 10,000 foot, steps, and not drinking the right amount of water. How do you deal with that in your own practice and your own life and your work?
Yeah. Well, I don't run ultra marathons anymore. I don't do Ironmans anymore. I've tamed that beast, I guess you could say. And make no mistake, there's nothing healthy about running marathons. There's nothing healthy about doing an ultra marathon. But my question for people is largely, and this is the question that I had for myself, why are you doing this? What's the purpose?
Yeah.
And that was where my work, when the transition really occurred probably about, I'd say, close to 12 years ago, which was roughly when I wrote my first book, which was Power, Speed, Endurance, which was the endurance we created a paradigm shift in the endurance world on high skill strength and conditioning work for the endurance athlete. This was something that endurance athletes just did not do in any way, shape, or form. Like, strength and conditioning and skill development was a last ditch resort when they were just banged up. And I started asking myself the question, why am I doing this? Because I got tired of hearing, like, what are you running from? When I asked that question, I dug down to understand that. And I saw an aspect of not necessarily just wanting to improve myself, but wanting to understand myself. Who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? And how do I look at this medium by using that? And I was able to actually articulate and understand that at that point, which also was why it was so easy to transition into the kind of space that I'm in now, which is centered around breath work, really, because it's really all about stress. That's what I believe. So two different things. We're the most evolved species based on a couple of things. One, how we work with energy, our metabolism, and B, because from a thought process, and you'll get this kind of because of that psychology degree, is our ability to understand that we can manipulate stress for adaptive possibilities. We literally understand that. We know every single day, whether we're recognizing this or not, we go and stress ourselves for an outcome that can be short-term, but also long-term, right? So this is about change be coming, but sometimes we don't want it, but that then forces something to happen, right? And that was where this is what my work really is centered around. Like, I can go in and work, like, I've got a gal who's running tomorrow track, could work with a world-class track athlete, or I could go work with a CEO, or I could go work with an operator, right? like who's and we're in a high stressed combative situation with firearms, and yet it's all the same thing. It's stress, but it's in different contexts, right? Or if we're running a marathon, right? And I don't by any means anymore encourage anybody to go out and have to engage in suffering in order to understand things. Culture's convinced us that's, of this enough, right? Like, and I mean, I think that's the beauty of what Sex at Dawn has really exposed was, hey, I mean, I routinely, and this is not my quote, I forget who I got it from, but routinely bring this up. And I think this is second or third time today, but it's culture's greatest achievement is the selling of suffering.
Yeah, that's a good line.
Right? We need politics, we need religion, we need this education system, we need this in order to thrive. And no, not necessarily.
Yeah, I agree. I have always been highly suspicious of any voice telling me that suffering is necessary.
You've done a good job of articulating that through your work.
Thank you. Well, that's another conundrum, though, right? Like, how do you write a book about the emptiness of writing a book, or, you know what I mean? Like, how do you promote your work when your whole point is like, you shouldn't need to promote anything, It's,
I mean, that's the thing. I was having this conversation on a podcast I do with one of my business partners about J. Krishnamurti. It's ironic that he disbanded, this organization that was trying to raise him up as the world leader of something. And he came to its opening and disbands this thing and talks about the dance with the devil. And he's like, the devil wants you to organize this. You don't get it. Right. I'm not the guy. Yet he stayed, he continued to write, and he continued to talk, and he continued to share because, it turns out, we need community. We need people, right?
Right. And sometimes, I was on somebody's podcast the other day, and he asked me what, as someone who's kind of naturally and philosophically against work, why did I bother? And my motivation, which ties into what you're talking about here, my motivation for both the books I've written so far is to try to help people avoid unnecessary suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
correct.
Like if I'll suffer a little bit to write the book so that lots of people can suffer less, it's a net gain. Unless I'm deluding myself, which is always a possibility.
This is always a possibility with us. And if we're critical thinking, if we think critically enough, that will always be the question. Yeah. But I think we're both on the same path, just couple different mediums, even though I've got a new book that I'm about to start and looking to go get a book deal on that, which will be centered around all this stuff. But I want to share with people what I've learned and how I've gotten through suffering and what tools I use to do that. And I don't think any one tool is a solution, which is what's the interesting thing about the breathwork space at this point was it's just like every time I turn my head, there's a new person who's, this breath guru, right? And it's like awesome. But we just stick to principles. It's just principally speaking, how does this function with us and why is it so important? And, why do we need to move? Well, because if we stop moving, we start dying. Turns out energy needs us to move.
Right.
So.
And energy needs to move through us, right?
Correct.
There's like a
flow. There's no end point, right?
Yeah.
All energy that's ever existed has always existed, and that is just it. It just was in a smaller, denser size based on what we currently understand. Yeah. And we just so happen to have one of the most efficient, or arguably the most efficient means for moving that energy, which is aerobic cellular respiration.
You mentioned your own suffering a minute ago and how you've moved beyond it. Where would you locate the worst suffering in your life? Has it been physical, emotional?
I would say emotional for sure. And that's been I've had some heavy duty physical stuff that I've gone through, but never has that physical trauma or traumatic instance really brought too much suffering because of the work I think I've done on that emotional side of things. Which, I've seen some very, very dark shit, because when you peel that onion down, it really comes down to, well, what did my childhood look like? And even though it looked like I had a great childhood, there were some serious issues that were occurring that I somehow inherited and dragged along throughout my life, as we do. And, when I peeled that thing down, it came down to rejection, right? Like, rejection is just this huge death sentence for all of us. And how we manage to deal with rejection gets displayed in our behavior. And I was like this puppet dancing with codependency in many relationships, but then I also was like this volatile, reactive person because I didn't understand what my boundaries were. But damn, if somebody crossed them, rah, and, all of that stuff took years. We're talking 20 years to really peel that down and look at and be honest about, and, be like, wow, it isn't them. People, all of us have issues, but it's like, I'm the coincidence in all of my issues, right? So I might as well start working on that coincidence.
Yeah. It's like that. What's that line? If you run into an asshole every once in a while, that's an asshole. If you run into an asshole every day, maybe you're the asshole, right?
Correct. Like, if everybody cutting me off in traffic it's personal, it's not them.
Yeah. It's funny. I notice that all the time. How the change in perspective changes perception so much, like when I cut someone off, it's just like, sorry, man, I just need to get off on this exit, nothing personal. But when someone does it to me, it's like, you fucking asshole, what's wrong with you? It's just like exact same experience, just to, which side of it are you on? Yeah. So how did your, when you work through this stuff, or, it's an ongoing process, I'm sure, but working through your childhood wounds and trauma and so on, how does that connect to the physical work that you do, and the training and the aerobic aspect of things?
Yeah. That's the interesting part. And this is, I think, where our work is most important. Like, this is where we're very unique in what what I'm doing here is very unique, because that's where the connection is most of us are actually training or doing something because we believe it's good for us. Well, that's culture selling you on something again. We think health is this thing we can put in a box and organize, and it's not. It's you go look at nature, you go look out in the wild, and you don't need to box that up, man. And is it ironic? I guess Jordan Peterson just did some podcast with somebody that they were talking about the split brain and all of this stuff going on in society. And I just got this on a thread. And, the guy who sent it at the end, he was like, wow, the scientist basically broke down that people who are healthiest are the ones that get outside into nature all the time and have very socially dynamic and healthy relationships. And I'm like, that shouldn't be a wow, dude. That should be a duh.
No shit, man.
Yesterday
I was walking on a trail with a couple of friends, and one of the friends is thinking about becoming a therapist, and she said, I don't know, maybe I'll focus on equine therapy, or maybe nature therapy, or maybe forest bathing. And the other friend who was with us said, you mean you'll teach people how to be human?
Yeah.
It's like, that's basically it. Live like a human being and you'll be healthy and happy.
Yeah. If we just pay attention to nature, and here's the interesting thing, a part of this, the paradox in it all, is that we continue to try and remove ourselves from nature. And so we say nature like it's this thing that's out my window here, right? Yeah. When we are nature. We can't run from the reality of consequences, right? Consequences is what nature is, and opportunity is how nature works. That which finds opportunity in very high stress situations out there wins and ends up evolving, because the best genes are the ones that make the best changes, right? And can find opportunity in those situations. But our physiology mimics that of the lion and the antelope, my man. And like, that's like, Sapolsky's studied all of this and put it all out in books, and you can go read it and go take his classes online, and you don't have to get it from me, but like, stress physiology is stress physiology. We just tend to think that we aren't a part of that, but we are a part of that. And so that we remove ourselves from this thing that makes us go look at ourselves, puts us right in front of ourselves as much as we can. And this is where we forget that we are nature. And it's like that physiology is a constant reminder. And if there's a physiological issue, it will manifest itself in a mechanical or a mental problem. There are going to be byproducts of that. And the question becomes, as my friend Fergus Connolly stated in a conversation we were having, is psychology just misunderstood physiology? And are the bells going, or vice versa, man, right? Like, and it's like, so, from the physical standpoint, it became, why are you doing this? Bruce Lee really was like a pioneer and will always be ahead of every curve that for the rest of time. He will be ahead from what he did with martial arts. He said be like water, right? Like, you gotta be, empty the glass, man. Like, be like water. Nature is like that, and it allows itself to adapt. And I think what we're doing is we're introducing people to the idea of, why are you doing this? What does this bring you? Are you using it as a practice to understand your life, your behavior through your day? Like, if I stick you in a cold plunge, why do you stay in that thing if it's every signal in you is saying get out? Because you understand there's this adaptive process that can occur. Okay, so you're going to stay in for 3 minutes. What's the point of that? What's the point of 3 minutes? Well, that's just what everybody else is doing. Bingo. Now we've got you. Now we're starting to see this whole emotional inheritance thing that starts to manifest itself, where we've taken on the idea of what culture is. And it's like, it's not that you can't be in there for 3 minutes. I didn't say that. I'm just challenging why you're here. So why are you picking up heavy weights? Why are you lifting weights that heavy and specializing so much in that, so that your cardiovascular system inevitably ends up having a problem down the road, when we're well aware we could take care of that and you can still get stronger?
Right.
It's, why are you doing this? Well, this is just what everybody else does. Perfect. Let's start breaking that down. Let's start really looking at why you don't honor yourself. Look at and find who you. I think we're all just a bunch of, we're every one of us, 7 billion children running around with an adult mask on. And there's a few of us that have decided to take the mask off and say, hey, I'm going to go look at, I'm basically kind of crazy enough but I'm willing enough to say, hey, I'm going to work on me. I'm going to work on this and really look at this and play that role and lead through that process. And I think that's what we need more of, is people who are willing to take a stand to understand themselves versus trying to just fit in. And I understand that need to fit in. I'm totally compassionate to it. It's rejection.
This sounds, when you describe your work, it sounds so oriented toward therapy. I was expecting to talk to a dude who was all about, increasing your cardiovascular fitness and, physiological stuff. But what you're talking about is very psychological and emotional, and it's a lot deeper than just physical training.
Oh yeah. It's taken a while. It's taken 20 years to get to this thing that I understood 20 years ago, but had no idea how to articulate it. Right. But to be clear, we're also the species that behaves pretty much in a way that thinks, we think that, like, I could go create a better training program for a lion living in the wild.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and by that, here's what I mean. I couldn't take a Comanche Indian back in the 1800s and create program that would make him more cardiovascularly sound. He's already doing everything, or she's already doing everything they need to do because they're paying attention because of how they live.
Right.
Right. I can't, I don't need to help that.
Yeah. Do you think, is it the case that, thinking about children playing, right? And the way children move, climbing things and jumping and running and falling and rolling and all, like, I feel like the older I get, it's one thing that drives me crazy about American culture is how, you want to walk, you get a treadmill. You want to, lift weights, you get, some kind of machine that they sell on late night TV. Everything gets categorized and turned into some form of work, as opposed to playing. And it seems like when you look at little kids playing, it's like what you said about the lion in nature or the Comanche, like they're responding to a voice within them that tells them how to inhabit their bodies and how to deal with the flow of energy. And culture, American culture in particular, is all about teaching kids to ignore that voice until it comes to the time they can't hear it anymore. And then we're obese and sick and depressed and so on.
Yes, sir. And this is what we're doing. So we have a bunch of children with adult masks on who are raising children to be just like them, versus people raising a child to be an authentic version of what it is that character could develop into. Right. And that doesn't mean being some strung out drug addict or whatever. Right. But I mean, like, my parents did a damn good job, and I still got mixed up in drugs and alcohol when I was younger. I got into trouble a few times, but I had enough of an upbringing that was supportive enough to where I was able to, oh, you know what? This really isn't working. Like, and I had enough experiences with, girls and all of these things to know that when I wanted to settle down or have a relationship with somebody that was monogamous, it was, hey, I want that. I've done all of this, right? So from a cultural perspective, we have really taken on like this idea that there's this box, there's this house we need to buy with a white picket fence and have 1.5 kids or whatever, and I get the nice car and do this and do that. It's like, I've just struggled my entire life to fit into that box. And now I'm finally at a point where I'm like, nah, I'm good. Like, I'm on the right path. I don't want to fit in that box. I want to figure out what this guy wants or this person wants without being too heavily influenced, even though there's nothing I can do about most of the influences that are occurring all the time.
Was there a pivot point in your life where you sort of shifted from trying to fit into the box to just abandoning it?
I mean, I would say it was so early. I had such high energy as a kid, and my parents didn't know what to do with me. And so it was like, take him to the pool and toss me in the pool. And I took to the water like fish. And it was like, I found swimming, and then I played water polo, but it was like and surfing, I grew up surfing and being in the ocean. But I think it was really when my brother and sister came along, because when they came along, there was this, now I'm not the sole focus, right? And so as a child, when that happens, it's like you start setting up these things. Well, rebellion won me attention. And so rebellion was that thing. But the rebellion happened because I think that I understood very early on that my identity was being challenged, which is where a perfect place for anger should sit when my identity is being challenged. Now, as I get angry, I should, after that, be settled and not have to harbor judgment and later, be affected by this. But unfortunately, that's not what we use anger for culturally anymore, right? That's where I would say probably around 5 or 6 was where the rebellion began. And it just transcended because girls like the bad boy. So that's where that fit in real early, maybe too early at some points. But then the alcohol and all that stuff. I mean, I was handed weed when I was 10 by some Hessians down the street, and it was like, oh, what was that? Like, what are those cool guys doing? I was just drawn to punk rock culture I grew up in Orange County in the 80s, and this was a hub for punk rock, skateboarding, and surfing. And it wasn't what you see on the Housewives of Orange County or whatever show you're checking out. It was very different back then, even though there were suburbs. But punk rock, I'm punk rock to the core. But I'm also like, I've done enough to where I'm not angry like that anymore. I'm very much calm, compassionate, but I also know my lines. Like, here's what that is. Don't cross that.
Yeah. So how did you get to where you are now? Sounds like you didn't come into this from a medicine perspective. It sounds like you came into it more through an athletics.
Yeah, totally.
And then
I like going
started
fast.
adding in.
Oh yeah. I like going fast. Like I like going fast. Like I like when the waves get bigger. Like I was one of the people who was like, if the waves got bigger, I got more excited. When the waves get bigger, there's the herd thins in the water, right? Now, I got a lot of friends, and they may hear this, that are in the big wave surf community. That is not the types of waves I go and deal with. Even though I've been out in that stuff, I like that going fast thing. I like pushing that edge and and the adrenaline of that and the feeling of, wow, I navigated that really well, or damn, I made some mistakes. What can I learn from that? And can I get back up on the horse and do it again? And I, in 46 years, have always gotten back up on the horse. And so for the performance stuff came through that desire to go fast, but then it was like, hey, like you're going to get through your 20s and things are going to start to change. Like I was well aware of that as everybody was indicating that. And and it has, but now it's like understanding, like I still like to go fast. I still like to downhill on my mountain bike. I still like to do skateboard. I still like to go and heavier surf. But I'm more calculated with what it is I'm doing. I'm more honest with how I'm actually doing that stuff and why I'm doing that. Am I prepared enough to be in water with 10 to 15 foot surf that I haven't been in for a year? I probably won't get in. I'll probably wait to get my conditioning up to be out and surf like that. But nonetheless, I want to be out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a good friend who's a big wave surfer from Santa Cruz, Kyle Tierman, and he's out on 40, 50-foot waves sometimes.
Yeah.
And, it's funny. We were in a situation once that got a little crazy, and later we were talking about it. I said, Kyle, you're a funny dude, man, because before we got into that situation, you were kind of awkward and weird. And when the situation was over, you were a little awkward and weird. But when the shit was really crazy there in the middle, you seemed totally relaxed. And, it's like you're like a pilot who knows how to fly a plane, but isn't real good at taking off or landing. And he was like, oh, yeah, man, that's why I surf. I'm relaxed when shit's crazy. Yeah. The rest of the time, I'm kind of nervous and I don't really know what to do. But when the shit's really crazy, that's when I'm most relaxed. It's a funny thing talking about stress, right? Which we were talking about earlier. Like stress is one of those words. I feel like we use it, but we don't really know what we're talking about. Because, you would say surfing down a 40-foot wave, that's insanely stressful. Mm-hmm. And yet for him, it's relaxing. Mm-hmm. Right? Because the stress triggers his relaxation. Whereas and a lot of us, when we're relaxed, we get stressful because we're thinking about shit and worrying about mortality or whatever. When you're actually facing the bear, you're not, you're almost relaxed because your choices are so limited and clear as opposed to when you're lying in bed thinking about it,
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I've seen this a lot. I've also seen it where, there's a few guys and, so like Laird Hamilton. So I was pretty close with Laird Hamilton for quite some time. Like, I was one of his closest training partners for roughly 4 years. And, going out with him in like 60, 70, 80-foot surf sometimes, you're like, dude. Like this is insane. And he'll just straight up tell people, like if they're out there with him, like, hey, if this is too hairy, if you're not feeling, you need to turn around and go back now.
Right.
I can't have you here. Then you go watch him pull into this wave, and all of a sudden it's like sound doesn't exist. And you're just, this dude is like on this wave in his and that's the place, right? And I mean, same thing with guys like Mark Healy and Kyle, who you're talking about. It's like, boom, there's their place, and it's just, but the thing is, I've found that those of us that can't actually turn it off and just slow it down, and I was this guy. Like, I was that guy that I was going fast all the time. And I still go fast, but I'm so much more. And this is what breathwork did for me. Like, it really showed me what I was doing and how I was doing it. And all this stuff started coming up. And it was like, I finally could just sit there and slow down. I remember thinking that meditation wasn't for me. I remember telling people that, like, it was my MO. My meditation is when I go running. My meditation is when I'm training. And that's just not it. That's just not it. That's bringing you purpose, and that's a facet of it. But the ability to sit and just drop out and feel it and be like, okay, what am I feeling right now? Why can't I slow down? Why do I have this need to constantly be on? And this is where I was able to dig down and see, oh, like, I've got this rejection piece going on, you know. And there's layers.
Did you do that with therapy, or how did you do that?
I've worked with therapists for over 20 years. Like, in the beginning, it was like I needed, right? Now I find people, and I'm like, I want to work with that person. I want to learn from that person. And I constantly am doing this. And so I constantly am working with a therapist of some sort at some time or another. And sometimes there's a need for it. But there's always a need for it. Like, I think anybody who does not use a therapist or has not, that's a problem. Culturally, this is you need somebody who you can actually feel comfortable enough to talk to get down to those layers of why things are the way they are. I truly think that, the ability to take off that mask and be open enough in saying, yeah, I'm fighting a war myself. Right? Like, I don't need to try and cover this up anymore. And that right there changes how you feel about the world. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Yeah. I actually I've been in Laird Hamilton's sauna, never met him.
Oh.
But I've been in the sauna with his wife and Neil Strauss. I was on their podcast, The Truth Barrel.
Yep.
The only semi-naked podcast I've done, I think. Yeah. And I met Mark Healy in Hawaii in the back of a pickup truck with Kyle. And we just chatted for about half an hour. Super nice dude. Totally down to earth, chilled guy. And then later, Kyle was like, you know who Mark Healy is? I was like, no, I don't know. Some guy in the back of the truck. He's like, dude, he's a legend. He's a surfing legend. I said, well, you could have told me. I didn't know that. I just thought he was some guy named Mark.
Yeah, really Mark is living as close to nature as anybody basically is. I mean, the dude literally gets his food by going into the ocean or going hunting for it. And then dives and surfs waves. Just a little redhead kid.
Awesome.
Moved to Hawaii, man.
Good move.
Yeah.
So I have a friend. I have sort of a similar. I mean, I've always found meditation difficult. I've done a fair bit of it. I started meditating when I was probably 10 years old, when I started doing martial arts as a kid.
Yeah.
But I always found it physically difficult. I did a Vipassana retreat, 10-day silent thing.
My man.
Yeah. I've done.
That's the ultra marathon of meditations.
Of sitting. I'm an ultra sitter. Yeah. But I've always found it like my back hurts, my knees hurt, my neck hurts. It's like, just sitting like this for 5 hours is. And then I have a buddy who owns isolation tank center in Austin, a really interesting guy, Kevin. And he invited me to go float a bunch, and I lived in Portland, and those guys invited me to float because I can't afford to be paying $75 an hour or whatever it is. But these guys were generous enough to just give me unlimited free floats. And I found like, well, this is what I was looking for when I was meditating. Because I get into this meditative state, but I'm not distracted by my joints, you know? Like my body disappears. And then I'm just like total consciousness. It's fantastic. But it's really hard for me to get there. My body, it sounds like for you, your body is a conduit to a meditative state. Whereas for me, it's a barrier, I think, in most senses.
Well, right now it is. It doesn't have to be, right? And I mean, just depending on how deep down into the hole you want to get with it, it's like, I mean, look, I had no intention of being able to sit there and meditate for 6 hours straight. None. I had some hormonal problems, issues that were compounded from a bike accident I had on my mountain bike. And I had this episode of insomnia for like 3 months that I had to figure out. And it was just horrific. I mean, there were like maybe 4 nights a week, I'd get maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep. The rest were just like an hour. It was horrific, right?
Yeah.
The only way I got through that was just laying there and breathing. And I was just following a breath pattern, and I'd just sit there and be like, you know, the only place I can go right now is just to be compassionate towards myself, because I can't function during the day real well. I'm having trouble with that. And it really just came to me. It was like, wow, like this isn't that hard if you're willing to just be in the moment. And that's exactly what something like a float tank can do. It's simply a perception change. It's helping you change your perception on what's going on. This is why psychedelics are so great for a lot of people. It's presenting this new view of what the world could be or is like that is totally distorted from your reality, right? And people coming out of things like ayahuasca journeys and mushroom trips and things they're like, wow, I just need to be a lot more like compassionate towards myself and the rest of people, you know, the rest of the world, you know, like there's no like magic here. It's just literally perception. Our view, our perception of reality versus what reality is what changes. And we've just gotten into this such fast-paced world. You know, I mean, the fact that we get to connect like this is awesome, but it still comes with consequences. The idea that we can still continue to do this, and so if there's problems, we're pissed off about it, right? Like, or whatever. You know, like there's so many consequences for having one of these things, right? Like, in 50 years, we're probably going to be like, God, remember that iPhone thing? Like, whoa, that was a mistake. Like, you know, like it's just like cigarettes, you know, like with social media. Like we already know social media is this horrifically, like it's just this thing that has allowed people's dysfunction to get so out of control. And nobody has to be responsible for that because, you know, they just don't. And this is the same thing that was happening with big tobacco and big pharma. And like, they're just, you know, producing things that help people in one aspect, but are killing them in another aspect. Oh, okay. You know, it's all kind of the same thing. We're just repeating it with different shit. And I feel like, you know, I don't know. It's just, as long as we can understand there's consequences with things and we're willing to look at that, like this fast-paced lifestyle is something I chose. I can slow this down at any point. And it just is going to take a little bit more work than I might understand, like I might want. And this is the biggest problem I run into with people who come to me, especially world-class athletes who've been going through brick walls, or operators, right? Special forces guys. Like these people go through brick walls for years, and then something finally starts breaking down enough to where it's like, fuck, I'm having panic attacks. I'm dealing with this. Yeah. I've got joint issues. I've got these problems. And it's like, yeah, so how much are you willing to look at here? All of it, any of it. All right, so let me know. Let's see how you're breathing. And their breathing will tell me everything already. Like it's already like somebody's, so we use this term called CO2 tolerance, which is basically how well you tolerate carbon dioxide, which is why we actually breathe. So we don't breathe contrary to everybody's kind of belief because of oxygen. Like we need oxygen for sure, but oxygen is, we have very little in the human body that's there to detect oxygen. We have a tremendous amount to detect carbon dioxide, because too high of levels of carbon dioxide is a pH shift that is a death sentence. And it turns out that there's a yin-yang prophecy that exists. This is actually principles, but oxygen cannot be made bioavailable without the use of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide has to enter the red blood cell in order to get the oxygen out so that it can perfuse with the cell. Now, all the scientific stuff out, if there's a direct correlation between, and this is the easiest thing to understand, physical work or metabolic rate going up and my respiration rate increasing. Well, yeah, when I work out, I breathe harder. That's CO2. And demand for oxygen has gone up, but CO2 is the mechanism because that's the byproduct of creating energy. It's one of the byproducts. From a passive side of things, just sitting here, how tolerant we are is a big telltale sign on how stressed out we actually are. And so from a psychological side of things, if I am taken on too much and I have emotionally or even task oriented, right? I am diminishing my ability to tolerate CO2. So my ventilation rate increases as a result of that. It's just unconsciously, these centers are set up in the brain stem. But the beautiful thing about breathing is that the moment that I take control of it, I just brought that cortex online. I took it off that brain stem, and now if I can control it and slow it, for instance, I've now brought on this calming effect. And even though I might be stressed, I've now given myself the ability to create new neural pathways in order to manage stress. I'm not saying I can change your thinking, but what I can help you do is get a hold of that physiology and that stress response, and then we can start to play into, hey, let's slow it down. Is there really a threat around you right now? Do you need to be somewhere right now? Do you really need to be, or is that just a perception? Is that just you thinking you need to be doing something else? And let's look at that. Why do you feel like you constantly need to be? Just look at why you feel like you need to do that. I'm not judging you either way. You look at that, right? And then so the thing is that that opens up possibility for people in ways that it's just a tool, right? Like to introduce and let's control your breathing. But this then opens up that pathway into which direction do you want to go with this? And that adaptability thing I kind of began with, where as human beings, our understanding of, I know I can partake in this stressful thing. Like we all know that if we were to lift some weights, we'd get stronger, right? So we know by engaging in stress, we can create adaptation. Well, it just so happens that this CO2 thing is highly adaptable. A human being just held their breath statically for over 20 minutes. You and I don't need to necessarily do that. Like that's very specialized, right?
Yeah. Is that a free diver or something?
Yeah. It's a free diver, right? But Mark Healy's held his breath for 7 minutes before. I've held my breath for 5, right? Like from a static, and it took me a little time to build up to that. But what's possible, we aren't aware of. We don't know what's possible, right? But we like to box that in still, you know? And then the other thing is that we also don't like to believe that things so simple could be that effective. And yet, when I go back to the Comanches or the Native Americans, it's been documented. I didn't make it up, but there's even a book written about it. And they all kept their mouths shut in most of everything they did. And their languages didn't have lots of words with little meaning. They had big words with big meaning. And So culturally speaking, the English language, we're just like always running our mouths, right? Rarely listening and seeing what's going on, and I mean, you look, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of philosophical stuff with what like I'm into, but it's, I mean, look, there isn't a book I can't read that I'm not like, whoa, this works with my work. Like,
right.
Like I go read Empire of the Summer Moon,
book.
I've read it 3 times and I'm like, damn. And George Catlin was cited in that book several times as a historian, wrote a book called Shut Your Mouth and Save Your Life because of what he saw between indigenous and civilized culture.
Really?
The biggest difference, yeah. Written in 1867, I believe.
I've never thought about the correlation between language and breathing patterns. That's a really interesting point that you raised there. I've like hung out with people who were raised in China and Korea, and I've noticed that they breathe through their nose in the middle of a sentence. That they'll be saying something in English, but they'll say something and then there'll be like a deep breath through their nose, back out, and then they continue speaking. And I've started to notice that commonality, but I never thought of the idea that it could be because they're raised in a language that promotes nasal breathing, whereas we in English, I think the language itself promotes mouth breathing. It's an interesting thing. Huh.
Yeah, correct. I mean, and that would be my theory, right?
It's almost like how shoes promote bad walking patterns and cause back problems.
Correct. Huh. So, but you look at this, and there's good reason for us breathing through our mouths when we're talking. I am coming up into a heightened arousal state as a result of this because I'm offloading carbon dioxide more than necessary, right?
Right.
When I do that, remember that bioavailability of oxygen? That just got reduced. Physiology doesn't give a shit. It really doesn't care. This is nature, all right? So we have anaerobic cellular respiration and aerobic cellular respiration. I just moved the needle more into that anaerobic side of things, so I'm using more sympathetic tone when I'm talking. So if I go give a speech or I go present or I get on a podcast and talk with Chris, anytime I'm talking, my arousal state increases. And it does it from a physiological perspective because I'm offloading that carbon dioxide. So I've moved that dissociative curve away.
Right.
Right. And then the moment I stop, I can shut my mouth and I can automatically, and I used to never do this. I used to always be thinking, what am I going to say next? What am I going to do? Say, right? Like versus how about you just fucking listen, dude? Listen to what people are saying. And that's the thing. And I mean, it's like, I've become a better listener. Yeah. Like I've just because I'm actually interested in what people are telling me because I want to hear what they're telling me. And they're telling me things that they don't know they're telling me. And you probably understand that a great deal. People will tell you exactly where they're at if you let them.
Yeah.
The other side of this is that the food choices that we've made have really impacted how the jaw structure works. And there's been a ton of work on this. There's a book called Jaws, The Hidden Epidemic that was done. And they talk about this in it, about nasal breathing. And I mean, if I don't chew foods enough, especially as a child, that jaw there's malformation in that jaw, and that is attached to my maxillobone, which shrinks the sinuses, which makes it more difficult to breathe. And then the nose starts to change itself, and it makes it much more difficult. But the beautiful thing here is that it's not a lost cause. It's not lost because the body's plastic till the body dies. And you could be 80 years old, and if we could get you just doing a few things a day, just taking some deep breaths, it can change everything.
Yeah. Did you get into breathing through Wim Hof, or were you in it before he came on the scene? What was your introduction? So I got into breathing because somebody handed me a training mask, one of those things people put on their face and train for oxygen. to measure?
No. It was a resistance breathing device that said elevation training mask on it, and I kind of laughed because I knew
Uh,
that it doesn't change barometric. It doesn't change the pressure in the air. And then I also know that it wasn't. There's no way it could have changed oxygen saturation levels. That said, I put the mask on. The moment I put it on, it provided resistance. I went and I sat up because that resistance forced me to use more of my diaphragm. Use my diaphragm in a way that forced me to organize myself very differently. And my background in movement instantly went boom, and my head blew up. And I was like, holy shit. Like, I've got something that we could use with athletes, like in warm-ups, now I don't have to yell at them about moving crappy. And now they're getting air in. Oh, wait. And then we discovered, oh yeah, just shut your mouth for a large majority of the time, and you've got a resistance breathing device there. Then it was, I then started exploring a lot of the yoga stuff, because I had some background in yoga, but I'd never really paid attention to the breathing aspect of it, even though that's the foundation of breathing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a 5,000-year-old practice. And, I'm like, oh, wow, they've been talking about this for quite some time. Then it was the Wim Hof. Laird and I were actually, he had handed me a little book that was written on Wim years ago, and it was like, I think it was just translated from Dutch, and it was pretty poorly done, but he's like, yeah, read this, because we were doing a lot of cold plunging. Like, Laird was the first one to shove me in an ice plunge, and it was not a pleasant experience at first, but it was interesting because he sat in there and talked to me for like 3 or 4 minutes like nothing was going on, and then I got in there and I was like, holy shit, like, I got to get out of here. I'm like, how long am I supposed to be in here? And he's like, oh, just do 3 minutes. And I'm like, I can't last 3 minutes. And I got out, and he just started laughing his ass off, like almost like rolling on the ground. And so he handed me this book. He goes, just read this. This will tell you more about the ice training. And it was about the Iceman. And
Yeah.
we got into it, and there wasn't much on his method. And they had just basically started translating his stuff into English, and nobody really knew about him. And Laird and I reached out to him, and we connected with him. And so there was an early onset with Wim Hof, but I found that, that was a very niche thing, and there was a method, and it was a beautiful thing. And he's probably one of the most important figureheads that have come forward for breathing, because more people are aware of breathing because of this guy. But I'm strictly a principles person. Like, I'm really like, hey, what I could use Wim Hof, but I could also use this slow controlled stuff. What's this mean? Like, how am I using oxygen? Like, how well am I functioning right now? And breathing is impacted in any way, shape, or form when stress is involved, because stress is energy, and all energy is run through this pipeline known as our respiratory system.
You ever read James Sarno's work, Mind Over Back Pain? Does that ring a bell?
No.
He was an interesting guy. It's kind of old now. Probably came out in the 90s maybe. But he was an orthopedic surgeon in New York City. I think he taught at Columbia University Medical School. He's a very prominent guy. Tens of thousands of spinal operations. And at one point, sort of late in his career, he started to notice that he had a lot of people coming to him with pain, and the pain expressed itself where they had a herniated disc. And so for, almost all surgeons were like, well, you got to fix the herniated disc, right? But then he noticed that sometimes people who had herniated discs had no pain. So the causal relationship between the herniated disc and the pain confused him, and he started looking into it more and more. And eventually he came to the conclusion that somewhere around, I think he said 70 to 80% of the patients that came to him with back pain were cured in one session, when he simply introduced to them the idea that stress expresses itself through back pain in people. And he would talk to them about, what's going on in your life right now? And it's like, well, I'm getting a divorce. Massive stress. So the stress in some people expresses itself through digestive disorders, insomnia, hair falling out, skin problems. But in a lot of people, especially Americans, it expresses itself through back pain. And it's the herniated disc isn't the cause of the pain. It's that the stress it finds weaknesses in the body, the mind body, right? And that's where it bulges out. That's where it expresses itself because there's a physiological weakness.
Yeah.
But the physiological weakness is not the cause of the pain.
Yes.
It's just the weak point where that stress expresses.
Yeah.
Really interesting. I mean, and kind of obvious to a guy like you who's working with the mind body as one unified entity. But in a culture where we see the mind over here and the body over there, it's kind of a revelation, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I would agree with him wholeheartedly. You know what I mean? You know, I think about this and it's like, I do a lot of work with PTs and inside the physical therapy world, sports medicine world, because of the work we've done with breath work and what we've been able to find. And, you know, it's not that these practitioners haven't been aware of this stuff. It's just they didn't know how much of an impact it actually had. And, you know, it's interesting because, you know, even within training, coaching, and in sports medicine, we're trying to help people get out of pain. And pain is there for a reason. Pain is nature's way of saying choose differently. And as practitioners, I try and get these folks, and I'm not a PT, but I've spent so much time with some very high level people, and you know I'm pretty movement savvy, and I understand movement mechanics, all this stuff, but I try and get them to understand that it's not their job to basically get people out of pain. It's their job to show people why they're in pain. And that's my job. That's what I do. I'm just basically teaching people how to feel again, what they're feeling. And I'm using breathing as that. And that was kind of the email and why we connected was like, look, man, here's what we're doing. I'm trying to show people the entire biological phenomenon and how stress is affecting them. And that back piece is a perfect example of, I mean, do you think our ancestors had herniated discs? You bet your ass they did. They worked their asses off. They sat in buggies, wagons going across the country, trying to make it, crossing Comanche territory, not knowing if they would live another day. So, the work really comes down. I really want people to kind of take this on, is that pain is there for a reason. It's nature's way of saying choose differently. And the uncomfortable side of this is that protection from pain and suffering is called trauma. And trauma is a choice. And this is a very hard thing for people to chew on because they don't want to believe. Now, this is a very different thing than a traumatic experience, right? Trauma being I'm holding on to something that I'm not willing to look at and I'm protecting myself. And this is what I uncovered was, this rejection piece, right? I am protecting myself from being rejected by either sabotaging shit myself in order to protect myself. And then it's simply trauma. And I worked with some trauma specialists to really get into the core of this stuff and understand it. And I'm using physical training as a means to show people their own trauma. Why do you think you have to work out every single day? That's trauma. You're protecting yourself from something. And if you get hurt, why are you freaking out? Because you can't work out right now and do your thing. Well, what are we not looking at? There's plenty of people in my network you can go work with, but if you're not willing to look at it, I can't help you. And, this is also why I charge so damn much for people it's I'm only interested in people who are really willing to cross over that line and say, I'm ready to look at this and really, really ready to work at it. But, I try and do a lot within the social media side. It's strictly business for me. My purpose is driven through that portal of hey, here's the discovery. Here's what we're seeing. Here's what people are doing. If you're, there's opportunity in all of this. And ironically, even the world's best, like we're talking gold medalists, world champions that are willing to take a look at this stuff and go down that path just a tad. They're making massive changes that are allowing them to stay in the game and understand that the game is not who they are. Right. And that's the problem, is like, oh, I'm nothing without this whole thing. You know what I mean? Were you able to see the documentary Michael Jordan thing?
Dude, okay, you and I just had a psychic moment.
Oh,
I was waiting for you to finish what you were saying, and I was going to ask you
ahead.
if you had seen that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I just saw it a couple weeks ago, and as you were talking about, I'm not the game, and there's much more going on than the game. I was thinking about how I watched all, whatever it was, 7 episodes.
Yeah.
And my feeling was like Michael Jordan was the least interesting person in that whole show.
Yes.
I was so interested in Phil Jackson and Scottie Pippen and Mike and Dennis Rodman.
What a quality human being Scottie Pippen is, huh? I'm just like, wow, why isn't this thing on him? Look at this guy who's the greatest athlete we've witnessed, who's 20 years out and still pissed off about shit. And by the way, nobody saw anything with his family, and he's sitting alone in his home.
I noticed
yellow,
that too.
Jaundiced eyes. He's obviously switched over to some drinking, and it's like, oh wife? My God, man. This poor guy is just a tortured soul.
And yet we're holding him up as the model, alongside, Michael Jackson, right? The King, Elvis, these sad, wounded, pathetic, self-destructive people in our culture saying that's the best. That's the goal right there.
Yep.
Whoa.
Yeah. Enter helicopter parenting.
Yeah, man. Hey, listen, Brian, I've taken an hour of your time. I really appreciate it. It's, this podcast, I used to hitchhike a lot when I was a kid. And people ask me like why I do the podcast. And the real reason I do it is that I love the feeling of getting into a car with a stranger, knowing very little to nothing about them other than they were kind enough to stop and pick me up, and just see where the conversation goes and just let it happen organically. And I just love when it works. And I feel like it really flowed with you today. I really enjoyed this.
Chris, thank you. And that's interesting. I'm wondering how many terrible experiences happened during the hitchhiking. Because you don't hear too many people who said I used to hitchhike a lot, as a kid. But
I'm old, so it wasn't as bad then. I'm almost 60, so I'm talking, late 70s, early 80s.
Oh, yeah.
It was still bad, but not that bad.
Yeah, well, that's great. I'm glad you're doing this, man. And I had a feeling we'd hit it off based on me, knowing your work and what you've challenged, and I felt like it would be a good connection. So
it turns out we have a lot. We have a lot of friends in common. Like, I've hung out a lot with Wim and his family.
Okay.
Yeah. Years ago, I was in Spain, and I reached out and I said I'd love to do a podcast with him. And I've been on Rogan's show a bunch, so that's a good calling card. People, sometimes make time for me because they see that connection. And and they were like, okay, sure, you can, we'll connect on Thursday on video or something. And I was like, no, I want to fly up to Holland. Like, I want to meet this dude. I'll fly up. And they're like, really? You come to Holland? Like, fuck yeah. So I went up and we did the podcast, and then Wim filled up the barrel with ice, and we got in the ice barrel and took a sauna, and they invited me to hang out with him and his family for a week in the Pyrenees, and we're up there, and now I know all his kids, and do you know his oldest son, Enam?
Enam, yeah. Oh yeah, we've spent time. They've all come out. We brought them out to LA and brought them to Hawaii, and we've done the Hoff.
It's a lot of energy in that family.
There's a lot of energy in that family.
Yeah. They're beautiful.
Good for them. Yeah, man.
All right. Well, listen, thanks, Brian. Really good talking to you. And I hope we can hang out together in meat world sometime.
Yeah, brother. Yeah. Good to meet you.